Back. So, as you've seen, we've been a little bit all over the place. By the way, one other person who needs to be especially thanked is right over there. That's Stephanie Steicher, who put this whole thing together. What are you pointing?
I want to thank also Spiro
Well,
and the wonderful staff at Panther, who always do an amazing job.
Right. So the last hour and a half or so, we're going to try and put a little order in all this. We've been all over the place, but I've asked Lisa Gunther, who's a professor of philosophy, actually, to put a little some thoughts about the phenomenology, specifically of solitary, as the subject of her next book, and then from there we'll have Juan Mendez, who is one of the most distinguished human rights people in the world. You can look at the biography, but currently, among other things, the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, and there's 4 or 5 other words in this thing, but you see that in the biography too. And then finally, Scarlett, and he'll put all this in some international context. And Scarlett Kim is one of the co-authors of this terrific report boxed in that the NYCLU just did. And then we'll get together and talk about what we can do to try and move things forward as a group. But let's start with you, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this meeting. And I just want to say that I think in the last discussion, we were really getting to some very important issues and making some connections already between what's happening on the inside in prisons and how, even if you are never unfortunate enough to be incarcerated yourself or to have a loved one incarcerated, how prisons, both the practice of solitary confinement and the larger context of mass incarceration in which it's embedded in the US, affect all of us in the US. We are a prison society, and that's, I think, what we really need to reflect on. So I have some philosophical reflections on solitary confinement that I want to share with you, but really I want to put the emphasis on the wisdom that we don't have access to here because we've locked people away. And also, I think that was a really important question that somebody raised. What about the youth who are on the street, who are facing stop and frisk policies, who are negotiating these and finding strategies to support each other and to stay out of prison or to get through prison and cycle out without being destroyed by it? We need to be in conversation with people who have that wisdom. It's one thing for us to speculate on the implications of solitary confinement and what it might mean to survive, to be able to keep oneself together in that context. We actually have people we can ask, and we've had 4 people give their testimony in this context here. We need more of that conversation going on. And so I just want to direct your attention to the booths that are outside, the tables. There's the New York Civil Liberties Union, who has their project that Scarlett Kim is going to be talking about later. Some literature on that, some literature from Solitary Watch, and also some literature from Russell Maroon Shoatz. And there's a campaign to free Russell Maroon Shoatz. You might not have heard his name already, but he's been in solitary confinement for 21 straight consecutive years in Pennsylvania. And he's been in prison for over 30 years. And he, too, was active in black radical politics in the 60s and 70s and was framed for a murder he didn't commit. And he was put in solitary confinement because he was organizing people within the prison. He became the first black president of the Lifers Club in the prison where he was. And so we need to make these connections between solitary confinement in its sort of putative carceral function of containing violence and the larger implications of repressing political voices of resistance within the prison by isolating these prisoners from others. Even in solitary confinement, Russell Maroon Shoatz continues to yell down the tier, and when they had open-faced bars in the earlier pre-Supermax form of solitary confinement cells, he would organize seminars of other people prisoners in solitary confinement, and they would teach each other, yell down the tier, talk about African history, or talk about military strategy, talk about politics. And these are the kinds of movements that have been going on right under our noses And we need to pay attention to those. So there's a lot of literature on that table, and there's also a meeting that you could attend if you wanted to participate in the campaign to free Russell Maroon Shoatz. All are welcome to the meeting. It's going to be on Thursday, December 6th at 7 p.m. at 339 Lafayette Street in Manhattan. And there are copies of this flyer that you can pick up out on the table. So the title of my talk is The Living Death of Solitary Confinement. And I think we already probably have a pretty strong sense of how solitary confinement is a living death, and even why it is. We are social beings, and to be disconnected both from other beings and from a kind of sensory openness onto the world, an experience of space with a horizon or an elsewhere, and not just the experience of oneself as an isolated individual in a box. These are essential to what it means to be a human being, and this is what we take away from people when we lock them up in solitary confinement. So from my philosophical perspective, we're not just isolated individuals. We don't just exist as a mind in a body, but rather we exist as being in the world. And the structure of our being in the world is thoroughly relational. We don't just exist in relation to other people, but we exist in relation to time and to space in ways that always exceed what the limits of our fingertips. The first project of introducing solitary confinement in the US was already mentioned as a project of rehabilitation and even redemption. It was explicitly conceived as a religious project of destroying the criminal so that there could be a death and rebirth of the citizen. This was at Eastern State Penitentiary, the first sort of formal penitentiary in the US. It's also designed as a kind of panopticon where someone could stand at the center of this hub, a warden could stand, or a correctional officer, as we now call them, could stand at the center of this hub and see down all of these different hallways. Each cell was like a little meditation chamber and had only a light at the top that they called God's eye. And this was explicitly conceived as a way of breaking people down so that they could be reborn and oriented towards this light. Now, this is, Eastern State Penitentiary is now a museum, and you can go there and tour it, and you can see the relics of these cells. This is what the cell looks like with, you can see the electric light at the side, but this is what it looks like without that electric light. And this is the kind of environment that people would have actually been living in. Just one window at the top that you can't even see out of. And so you don't have an experience of space as having a beyond, a horizon. But only the outside is a source of light that you can never contact. And this was supposed to reconstruct the very structure of people's being. And I think the fact that solitary confinement can produce hallucinations, can produce these sensory distortions where people sometimes see the cell doors wavering, or surfaces of objects bubbling, see figures come to light out of a cell wall like this. Earlier we had a neurologist talking about how, in a sense, when you're cut off from a heterogeneous sensory experience of the world, your brain produces the sort of stimulation that it lacks, almost like a phantom limb is produced when there's no longer reafferent information being sent back from that limb. To be isolated in solitary confinement is to have a part of your being amputated. And those sorts of spontaneous creations of scenarios, whether painful and haunting, or entertaining and amusing, are a kind of effect of this amputation, I think. I wanted to engage a little bit with some of the testimony that the people who have spoken about their experience today have published in other work. And so Robert King, in an article, sort of an interview from 2010 in the Guardian, talks about your experience of pacing the cell, and also of feeling like you had started to lose your sense of vision from being in that enclosed space. So I was reflecting on this, and I think it's hard to make sense of that, of these sensory distortions if you just think of people as individuals with sensory capacities that are built into the mind and that belong to us as minds, as individuals, rather than as this complex relational being in the world. But as soon as we start to think about existence as relational, it becomes clear why people would lose the capacity to see from a deprivation of something interesting and different to see. That the walls themselves can hamper the eye's ability to see them and to focus clearly on even the unfolding of one's own conscious experience. I think that phenomenology helps us to see why this is the case, that consciousness is always consciousness of something, and that we experience the world through these frames that where the meaning of things is not already given in those things, but rather it's through a process of co-creating the meaning of our experience with other people that we come to have a coherent experience of the world in the first place. The basic coordinates of our meaningful experience of the world, I think, are the here of our own body and the there of another person's body, who looks at us and speaks to us from their own here. It's this coordination of here and there that opens up the three-dimensionality of sensory and social space. So every time I hear and see a sound and another person looks at that sound and looks towards the origin of it, I receive a kind of implicit confirmation that what I heard was something real, that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. Every time someone walks around a table rather than just walking through it, I receive a kind of unspoken, usually unremarkable confirmation that the table exists, that it has an objective reality, and that my own way of relating to tables is shared by others. When I don't receive these implicit confirmations, I can usually ask someone. But for the most part, we don't have to ask because our experience is already confirmed in these pre-verbal, bodily, everyday, unremarkable ways through our social relations with others. This multiplicity of perspectives is like an invisible net that supports the coherence of my own experience, even or especially when others challenge my interpretation of the world. So what happens when we unhinge people from these basic coordinates of the here and there and here of our spatial experience? This is a picture of Angola State Penitentiary. Oops, I forgot the N. From overhead. I just want us to get a sense of what these places look like. And here's a sketch of Herman Wallace's, one of the other members of the Angola Three, his sketch of his cell. And another sketch of his cell. Here is a picture of a Supermax unit in Cleveland, and another one in Illinois. Notice the bare walls and the deliberate lack. These are deliberately designed to reduce sensory stimulation. And here's an image from Shane Bauer's article in Mother Jones, and we saw this cell in the video. Notice that it's a double cell, so two people live in this cell, which does not at all reduce the isolation and can even intensify it because it puts the burden of having to negotiate this space that is not livable for one person, let alone for two, puts that burden of kind of blocking out the other person so that you can have some sort of solace and rest for yourself on that individual. And I think this is something that Breitenbach brought out very beautifully, that and also Tim Blunk, that the person in solitary confinement is made a kind of accomplice in their own undoing. That it's this openness that I think is the openness of our being in the world onto other people and onto the world that is being exploited. And it's our own capacities for resistance, for thought, for consciousness that are turned against us, such that if we didn't have the capacity to feel and to respond affectively to our world, that couldn't be used against us. That's one of I think, the really horrible things about solitary confinement. So when we isolate a prisoner, we deprive them of this intercorporeal network of support. They might still have an experience of the table that's bolted in place in their cell, and they may still have the memory of what tables mean for other people. But that lived experience of objects as both for me and for another who is not me has been largely denied to them. The there that would otherwise anchor their experience of the world from here has been pulled up, casting them adrift without a clear orientation point. So how do people cope with this loss? We've heard a few stories about this, from inventing the rooster or experiencing the rooster who talks to you about Hegel, to having these dreams that you're in the space shuttle and both taking solace and getting excited about that dream and using it as an anchor for explaining the surreal surroundings that you're stuck in. There's an anthropologist, Lorna Rode, who has done an ethnography of Washington State supermax prisons, and she describes a scene that she witnessed on her first visit to a Washington State supermax prison. I'm going to show this exercise yard in Pelican Bay State Prison because it's very similar to the one that she witnessed this scene in. There's a prisoner, Jamal Nelson, in the solitary exercise yard, swinging his arms from side to side in widening circles until his knuckles start hitting the concrete walls. He continues to swing, splattering the concrete with blood, relentlessly marking the limits of the space allotted to him, as if oblivious to the pain and even to the walls themselves. What would drive someone to do this? We could invoke mental illness, but without a further analysis, mental illness as a kind of label attached to an individual mind is inadequate to grasp the complex relations of self, world, and other in Nelson's experience. Shane Bauer, in his video, described solitary confinement as an abyss. What is an abyss, though? It's a chasm without edges, without orientation points. It's an emptiness that has become kind of palpable and insistent, like a black hole that sucks everything else into it. As a phenomenologist, I would say that the abyss is an experience of space that has become unhinged from the world, the intercorporeal world that we share with others, and within which we get both a sense of the here and there and of an elsewhere, a sense of a horizon of possibility. This is the sense of the future, I think, too. Space and time are connected in this way, and the blockage from a lived experience of possibility, of another person who could surprise me. I think it was Mike Daisy who said that this would be something that would imagine that this would be something emptied and drained from his life, this element of surprise. The meaning of the future and the meaning of space as referencing an elsewhere is, I think, related to this capacity of other people to surprise us and to respond in ways that we don't expect. The prisoner who bashes his own body against the walls of a rec yard is both, I think, refusing and confirming the abyss of solitary confinement. The self-battering body makes a statement of sorts. These walls might confine me, absolutely, but I absolutely refuse to be confined. There's a world out there, a there to which my here is correlated, and I will find it even if I have to hurl my own body against these walls. This kind of resistance might be self-defeating, but it remains, I think, an eloquent expression of the depth of emotional and ontological harm that prolonged solitary confinement can inflict upon a person. Some prisoners find other ways of coping with the exhaustion of spatial horizons. So in that same article, Robert King writes, "Some days I would pace up and down from left to right for hours, counting to myself. I learned to know every inch of that cell. Maybe I looked crazy walking back and forth like some trapped animal, but I had no choice. I had to feel in control of my space." I think we could contrast this to the response of Jamal Nelson to space in bashing his body against the walls. But unlike that bashing, the habit of pacing both resists and reinscribes the limits of place that block an experience of intercorporeal depth. Unlike bashing, pacing develops a more sustainable coping mechanism, a way of feeling in control of your space even if you don't have the power to change places. The prisoner who paces both refuses to sit still within his allotted space and refuses to destroy his bodily integrity by bashing against the walls. I think it's a way of insisting that one's still a living, moving being, even though the world has been diminished to the point where one's no longer able to live and move freely. Pacing doesn't express an acceptance of limits, but rather a nervous retracing of them, a habit founded around the impossibility of habituating oneself to what is an intolerable situation. In this sense, I think it's still a way of coping, but even this coping mechanism can become a pathology that becomes its own compulsive trap. And Robert, I'd love to talk to you later to see if you think that that in any way articulates something of what is going on in the pacing around the cell, and tell me if it's bullshit, because I really want to know. These strategies of resistance and of survival are impressive and even heroic. They attest to the creative capacity of human beings to sustain a sense of being in the world, even when they've been excluded from the world and forced to live in a concrete box. Along with these individual coping strategies, prisoners in isolation have managed incredible feats of political organizing. Witness the hunger strikes at Pelican Bay and other California prisons, the 2010 Georgia prison strike, the continuing political action of the Angola Three to release Herman Wallace and Albert Wood Fox and all prisoners in solitary confinement, the political activism of Russell Maroon Shoatz, who continues to shout words of advice and support. Teresa Shoatz's daughter is right here, and Sharon Shoatz's other daughter is right here too, so you can talk to them about their father's struggle and their own struggle to both free him and end this double system of solitary confinement and mass incarceration. Prisoners may be isolated, but they're not for that reason passive and helpless. As long as prisons have existed, so too has the resistance against political oppression, social oppression of poor people, people of color, and anyone who speaks out against the system. And yet, without the support of people on the outside, prisoner-led movements are too easily silenced and marginalized. I think what we need to realize is that our own being in the world is bound up with the being in the world of prisoners. It's not just that we've isolated them from our world, we've also isolated ourselves from prisoners, and our own world is thereby diminished. Look at these places. These are aerial shots of prisons across the US. Someone already brought up this phrase, there is no there. And yet prisons are everywhere in our midst. They're in our cities, in our forests, on our highways, in our dead-end streets. They're in our light industrial areas and our low-income neighborhoods. Carceral landscapes are sometimes indistinguishable from places in the free world. Prisons that I've visited remind me of bus depots. Now, this is not a prison that I visited, but this is a prison in California, visitors area, school cafeterias, public libraries, and college campuses. This is actually an image of Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where I do a weekly philosophy discussion group. This is Unit 2, or death row. This is a prison. This is not like a state college. And yet there are college classes going on there. These similarities between carceral landscapes and our own landscapes in the free world remain invisible to us as long as the prison system is functioning to keep them in and to keep us out. Back in 1842, Charles Dickens observed that solitary confinement, quote, makes the prisoner's senses dull and by degrees impairs the bodily faculties. That was in American Notes. He visited Eastern State Penitentiary. But he also observed that because it leaves no visible marks on the body and because prisoners are hidden away from view, solitary confinement affects the public's capacity to see what's right under our noses. He writes, I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. and because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye and sense of touch as scars upon the flesh, because its wounds are not upon the surface and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear, therefore the more I denounce it as a secret punishment which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay. It's not just the prisoner who's affected by solitary confinement. So too is the public's capacity to see and hear the damage that is done in our name, for the sake of our own apparent safety. Solitary confinement is most clearly and immediately a form of violence against the being of the world in the world of the prisoner. But since being in the world is also a being with others, and since our here is intertwined with their there, it cannot help but affect our own capacities to see, hear, and make sense of our lives. We're missing a whole component of what it means to be American if we're not thinking about prisons. Think about it this way. This is my conclusion. On the outside, we're free to undervalue the role that our relationships to other people play in supporting our own capacities to think and to perceive. We can indulge in this myth of the individual self-sufficiency without having to actually live that myth. We help ourselves to the support of others all the time. Only the prisoner in solitary confinement is forced to occupy that position that classical liberalism and much of modern philosophy assigns to humanity in general. Only they are expected to bear the full weight of their individual existence alone without the support of others who are in some way geared into their lives and not just blocking, even in their interactions with each other, blocking a meaningful engagement with them. And to take the blame for their own collapse should they prove unable or unwilling to manage this support. As long as our own freedom is secured through the punitive isolation of others, even or especially if these others remain invisible to us, it's a sham and a shameful kind of freedom, and it diminishes our own capacities for critical awareness. I want to conclude with a passage from Emerson's essay, Nature. He says, "The health of the eye seems to demand a horizon. We're never tired so long as we can see far enough." The practice of solitary confinement threatens to exhaust the world's horizon. It turns space into an abyss and exposes the mind to what Shane Bauer called blank static. But prisons are a part of our world, and like it or not, they're on our horizon. As many as 80,000 of our fellow citizens are being held in solitary confinement right now, as Ren said at the beginning of the day. The health of our own eye demands that we see them. I just want to conclude with this final image of a kind of reciprocity through letter writing that opens up the prison, a kind of model of Eastern State Penitentiary, to communication. You can go online and Google, write to political prisoners, and find all kinds of addresses of people that you can write to and be in communication with, including Russell Maroon Shoats. And there are lots. Okay, so thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. Now we begin to turn to what can be done and what must be done. And I think a good place to start is with Juan Mendez, who himself once a political prisoner in Argentina, but who has become one of the leading human rights workers in the world and is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. Juan, maybe first question for you is going to be, is this torture? And is this part of your remit? And if it is, where do the United States fit within it? So, Juan Mendez.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ren, for holding this for me. I've been learning a lot all day, and also for inviting me. I am I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. That's the full title. And I am, although this rapporteurship has been around 27 or 28 years, I'm the first person to hold it who is a survivor of torture himself. I spent a year and a half in prison in Argentina, and of those, only a few days at different times in solitary confinement, but I have a glimpse, at least, of what it is. I want to explain why I wrote a special report to the General Assembly of the United Nations about solitary confinement. And this was about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and I was surprised that it got much more resonance than I had expected, among other things because civil society organizations in this country especially, but also elsewhere, have been working on solitary confinement and seem to have taken the report that I wrote as an instrument to campaign around the abolition, or at least the more careful regulation of the use of solitary confinement. The title of my rapporteurship is relevant to this because, and relevant to Ren's question as I was walking up, because international law prohibits torture and prohibits cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and or punishment, and it prohibits them both in an absolute manner, without any consideration of emergency or even individual reasons for engaging in either torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment can excuse the responsibility of a state for doing it, for inflicting that. But unfortunately, it doesn't say much about how torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment happens. We know torture when we see it, but we have to bear in mind that in international law, these two categories are related in a manner of degree. Therefore, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is a less demanding standard than torture, and also torture requires a deliberate infliction, whereas for cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, it can result from negligence or from just bureaucratic exercise of power without anybody deliberately wanting to inflict pain and suffering. But pain and suffering are the operative words. If there is pain and suffering that crosses a line into first cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, thank you, or second, more seriously into torture, then the international prohibition is clearly there. And my predecessors in the rapporteurship, as well as the Committee Against Torture, which is the implementing body of the Convention Against Torture, to which the United States, by the way, is a party, clearly establish that that under some circumstances, solitary confinement can be either cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or even torture. The problem is they always said can or may or under certain circumstances, but I thought that I could kind of push the envelope of the debate and try to determine under what circumstances we can talk about pain and suffering that crosses that threshold into cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or even torture. You should bear in mind that my mandate is narrow to conditions of detention. I can't and I don't get engaged onto whether somebody should be in prison or not, or should be tried, or should be prosecuted or not. But if that person is under any form of detention or deprivation of freedom, then I look at the conditions and see if this threshold that I'm talking about, these thresholds that I'm talking about are being crossed. But the reason to write, and of course discrimination on the basis of race or any other form of discrimination is part of the standard too, because the Convention Against Torture specifically says that treatment that is inflicted that crosses the line into pain and suffering of this sort, and that it is inflicted because of racial or other forms of discrimination, is also prohibited absolutely by international law. I wrote the report because in my experience as the special rapporteur, I was getting more and more cases from around the world on the uses of solitary confinement, isolation, segregation, and a variety of names. And early on, I worked on the case of Bradley Manning that I'm sure you've heard about, and I did conclude and published my views that the 8 months that he spent in Iraq and in Quantico Marine Base near Washington under solitary confinement were a violation of the United States of its obligations under the Convention Against Torture, because there was no justification for such a prolonged period of solitary confinement, even in pretrial detention. The only explanation that I got from the Pentagon was that his solitary confinement was related to the seriousness of the crime that he was charged with. But it seems to me that if you're only charged with a crime and you haven't been found guilty of it, there's really no reason to establish that. I have to say also, as you know, that when he was transferred in April of 2011 to Fort Leavenworth, he was no longer placed in solitary confinement. And but anyway, simultaneous with the case of Bradley Manning, I was getting cases from the United States, but also from several other countries. And it seems to me like, and this is unfortunately impressionistic because I really don't have statistics, that around the world solitary confinement is being used more and more, and that is being used for different purposes. And with the more that it is used, the less that it is surrounded by any kinds of guarantees of due process in the determination of whether someone should be put in solitary confinement or not, and less guarantees of medical health, less insistence on making sure that it doesn't have the negative effects that we now know it has. It's also used for various purposes. For example, in some countries, it is the actual way in which long prison terms are actually served. You're actually convicted to, say, 20 years, and you actually serve them in solitary because the crime is very serious. In some other countries, for example, where the death penalty is under some kind of moratorium and there's an automatic commutation of sentence to life, the people who are taken out of death row and into a life term are actually put in solitary confinement, who knows for how long, right? And it's even in very highly democratic countries like the Nordic countries, it is used in pretrial detention for purposes of ensuring the integrity of criminal investigations. And so, for example, if they want to disrupt a network and they have some people in custody and some at large, in order to prevent them from communicating, the people they have in custody, they put them in solitary, but up to like a year, for example, not a few days, not just to prevent immediate communication, but for long terms. So because of all these various uses, and for example in Latin America, it used to be that regulations established that no more than 21 days at a time for disciplinary offenses was available. And to everybody, to my surprise at least, in the democratic period that we are living now in Latin America, and without the public really being conscious about it, the regulations have been changed so much so that in Brazil, in Argentina, in Paraguay, the regulations contemplate that somebody for disciplinary offenses can be put in solitary confinement for up to 9 months, for example. Obviously, those are not the worst problems in prisons in Latin America. Let's put it in context, but it is a trend, and that's why I thought we needed to talk about this. The thematic reports of the special rapporteurships are an opportunity to discuss standards, especially when there aren't any. And unfortunately, in the case of solitary confinement, the only standard that we have is if it inflicts pain and suffering that crosses a certain threshold, and that threshold is unfortunately both objective and subjective, so it's not a clear line, then it's prohibited. But beyond that, and beyond the fact that the Committee Against Torture and my predecessors as special rapporteurs have from time to time said that they think that under certain circumstances, solitary confinement can be cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or even torture, there hasn't been that much conversation about what those standards are. In fact, when I spoke at the General Assembly a year ago, the US representative, when she intervened, she said, we use it and there are no standards. And I said, yeah, exactly, there are no standards and we should start talking about those standards, because otherwise the fact that there are no standards doesn't mean that you can do anything you want with it. So I wrote this report, and I am happy to say that it got much more resonance than I had expected. It's not only that what I discussed about the fact that civil society groups and solidarity groups in the United States have found it useful, but for example, simultaneously, the Committee to Prevent Torture, which is an organ of the Council of Europe that visits prisons on a regular basis, they published also in October of 2011 their own annual report, and they called for regulation of solitary confinement because they thought that in Europe solitary confinement was getting out of hand. And as a result, Norway, at least I know, and maybe Sweden and Denmark as well, have announced a review of their practices of solitary confinement in pretrial detention. In addition, in the meantime, as you know, there's been the hearings in the Senate presided by Senator Durbin that have really called attention on what solitary confinement really is, and an excellent editorial in the New York Times. And the Tams prison in Illinois has been announced that it is going to be closed precisely because it uses solitary confinement, although it's not clear that Illinois is going to abandon solitary confinement altogether because they may still use it in other prisons. But the fact that an emblematic place like Tams is going to be closed down, I think, encourages all of us to think that there are things that we can accomplish and that it's worth fighting against this trend. And we're going to hear later about the announcement by the New York State, in fact, that there is going to be a review thanks to the report that Scarlett and others have written for the New York Civil Liberties Union. So my attempt at defining the problem starts, as I said, with the definition of pain and suffering. And the fact that it may have a delayed effect should not make it any less a matter of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or even of torture. Many of the cases that I was looking into, the authorities would say, well, we're monitoring the person and they're fine, there's no problem. And I think that in addition to not relying exclusively on what the authorities say or their doctors, we should also insist on the fact that pain and suffering could be immediate, but it could also be on a delayed effect basis as well, and it would still violate the obligation of the state. And I relied as much as I could, of course, on medical and psychiatric literature that clearly explains that at some point, and it's a relatively early point, the mind starts working differently when you are in 22 to 24 hours a day looking at a wall. And so without getting into much more details about what the report says, I did make some proposals. And my recommendations were to encourage the international community as a whole to come up with absolute bans on some forms of solitary confinement. First, an absolute ban on indefinite solitary confinement, because it seems to me that the fact that you don't know when it's going to end, the fact that you don't know what you need to do to make it stop, adds a degree of anxiety that obviously has to have negative effects and adds an additional degree of pain and suffering. I also propose a ban on prolonged solitary confinement. And then I found myself in the position of having to say, well, after after how many days can we call it prolonged? And I recognized in the report that this is necessarily arbitrary, but I said anything beyond 15 days should be at least suspect. Now, I've been, challenged on that. Thank you. I've been challenged on that because it really depends. 15 days of 24-hour complete, isolation is one thing. 20 days with, for example, access to reading material, access to television, access to radio, may be a little different. But I made it a point to make sure that whatever, even if we fix it at 15 days or if we fix it a little higher, we need a maximum term. We need a maximum term, and it cannot be measured in months, and it cannot be measured in years. It has to be measured in days. And it has to be measured in days, and quite frankly, it is arbitrary, but 15 days I borrowed from the medical literature that says that after 15 days, it's when the brain starts working differently. And that's why I think, at least 15 days should be a starting point. And yes, we may be able to come up with some other maximum term, but it can't be, as I said, much longer than that. I also called for a complete ban, again, relying on the medical literature, on imposing solitary confinement on juveniles and imposing solitary confinement on people with any kind of mental disability. And then for those cases in which solitary confinement may be legitimate, let's say that, for example, for the protection of the person himself or herself, or because this is a predator that cannot be let loose in a general population, then I think my report also calls for some safeguards, several safeguards, but mostly due process safeguards to make sure that there is access to administrative and then even to judicial review that's meaningful, that's not, a token gesture, and that provides the person who's going to be put in solitary confinement an opportunity to challenge the decision or to challenge the form of the manner of the execution of the decision as well. And also medical and psychiatric safeguards. And I propose that no one is ever put in a single day of solitary confinement without a serious medical examination prior to the moment in which that person is going to be put in solitary confinement. So I'll be glad to discuss some other aspects of the report if you're interested. But I want to say that one of the most interesting things that I read after this report is a book in Spanish called Memorias del Calabozo. It's loosely translated as Memory of the Cell. It's written by two Uruguayans, Eleuterio Fernández Huidobro and Mauricio Rosenkopf. And these are two people who, because they were well-known leaders of the Tupamaro guerrilla movement, they were among, I think, something like 15 people who were held as hostages by the military dictatorship and held for 11 years, moved around different military installations in Uruguay and held in solitary confinement for the whole 11 years. And these two people tell of themselves and of their third friend who was with them. They were in such strict solitary confinement that they actually devised a system of communicating with each other via sort of a rudimentary Morse system by making noises against the wall. And for 2 years they were in non-contiguous cells, so they couldn't even do that. It's a very painful story, but it's full of some very Uruguayan kind of black humor as well. So it's really a great read. And I finish with mention of this book because nowadays Eleuterio Fernández Huidobro is the Minister of Defense of Uruguay. So that should give some hope, just like the very good uplifting stories that we heard in the previous panel. And the third person that they talk about is Jose Mujica, who happens to be the president of Uruguay today. And he's not only the president of Uruguay, he's credited worldwide for being the only president of any country that is poor, that is not a rich, a wealthy person. Well, thank you very much.
So as I was saying, we will be having a little panel at the end of this, but to talk about the force that Juan's report either has or can be made to have by people like us. But first I want to hear about the recent report by the New York Civil Liberties Union, which has gotten a lot of press and which we likewise have to use to move things forward. And Scarlett Kim is one of the co-authors of that report, and here she is.
Hi. So I want to say, first of all, I'm very honored to close the day out as the final speaker, and I'm particularly honored to share the panel with Professors Gunther and Mendez, who bring respectively philosophical and international insight and perspective built on a lot of study and thought. But I did think it might be appropriate for me to close out the day for a couple of reasons. The first being, I actually want to bring the discussion home, and I want to talk about what's happening in New York. In other words, what's happening in our state and in our community. And I don't want to just talk about what's happening to prisoners in New York, but also why all New Yorkers should care about what's happening to prisoners in our state. Second, the NYCLU project focused not only on the local in geographic terms, but more than that, really on the granular and the micro in terms of how solitary confinement works. And we really sought to understand how it works, who's being subjected, what do these people look like, sound like, what are their stories, and what these individuals were experiencing, both in terms of their physical environment and mentally and emotionally. And I want to add a footnote, which is that on the one hand, solitary confinement, despite its varied iterations across contexts, serves a fundamentally similar purpose, which is to impose social isolation, sensory deprivation. On the other hand, the picture is very, very complicated, even in the United States. So we can't just talk about solitary confinement as a kind of monolithic thing. It occurs in the federal system and in almost every state system. And each system uses it for a slightly different constellation of reasons. And the pathways to reform, I think, are going to look slightly different in each context. And so I think that a nuanced understanding of solitary confinement really requires us to take the discussion down to the micro level. Finally, the reason why I hope it's appropriate for me to close out today is that our project focused first and foremost on narratives and the power of narratives. I personally communicated with over 100 different individuals incarcerated in solitary confinement, mostly by letter, but I also conducted multiple face-to-face interviews. And my purpose was really to try and build relationships and to gather very rich stories. Because I wanted to represent these individuals who couldn't speak for themselves because by virtue of their incarceration, not as symbols or archetypes, but as very complex human beings with complex stories. So I want to end on the note that work, gathering stories and humanizing prisoners, is difficult, but I think very critical. And I think that it's important to remember that solitary confinement is not just something that happens passively, but something that we actually do to people. So with that in mind, I wanted to start with a short film that some very talented people at the NYCLU produced, which features interviews with family members whose loved ones are currently in solitary confinement.
If I were to take my dog and put him in a box for a whole year, I'd probably go to jail for that. But they think that that's okay to do to human beings. So it's not easy knowing that someone that you love is in a box, no sunlight, no contact, I pray for him, you know, that his mind doesn't go, because that's meant to like really affect a person's mind. So I pray that that he stays sane.
Over the last 2 decades, New York, like a lot of states, has seen a tremendous increase in the use of extreme isolation, or what a lot of people commonly refer to as solitary confinement. Currently, there are approximately 5,000 extreme isolation beds in about 39 different prisons spread all throughout New York State. We set to figure out what exactly happens inside of these extreme isolation cells, and what are the costs, both inside and outside prison walls.
Before Damo was incarcerated, when he was put in a box specifically, I just thought that, you know, for people who were like misbehaved, they went to the box for a month, 2 months, 3 months. I never knew that they put them there for that as long as they do.
I think when you talk to people who have been through it, they're not the same as when they went in. I think the box does nothing but hurt. It's harmful, it's torture. You don't get any skills in there. You're just, you know, you feel less than human from, you know, the accounts that I've heard from my son and from Carlos. And what skills are you possibly learning in there? Nothing. So coming home is even worse of a transition. I think not only for Carlos, but for a son who's also dealing with being in solitary, we can give, but only so much, because there's been so much damage.
The thing that I worry about when he comes out, though, is if he'll still have that mentality, you know, that says, you know, I'm an animal, you know, because I've been treated that way. You know, if we build people up, then we help ourselves, you know, and I wish I would see more of that rehabilitation, so that when they come out, they're not going back in. And when they come out, they can actually contribute, you know, in a productive way.
The darkest moments, you know, sadly to say, is every day. Because, first of all, I never know as a mother if my son is still alive. And I also don't know whether or not Carlos or my son, once we're back in the same household, what's that going to look like? How much do we have to put into trying to fix and mend and understand and be gentle? How much healing time will there be, if any?
Well, extreme isolation inflicts psychological and emotional harm on all individuals, regardless of their mental stability. But for super vulnerable people, like those with pre-existing mental health issues or juveniles, it can be devastating and potentially life-threatening.
Now that I'm back in upstate Colfo solitary, I toss, turn, and wake up several times at night due to the pain, screaming, crying, and cursing. I toss and turn and wake up several times at night. I feel like I'm developing some kind of schizophrenia behavior. I hear the voices echoing as I try to fall asleep. I feel like I'm developing some kind of schizophrenia. Voices echoing as I try to fall asleep.
Since he was younger, there was always a little something different about Carlos. I'm not sure when he was first diagnosed, but I think it was later on in his teenage years or early 20s. And he already had a mental illness which was exacerbated by being in prison and then by being put into a box where his hallucinations and his thoughts just developed more. Felt like society had threw him away and didn't care about him. He describes it vividly as just being a small box that sometimes gets smaller. It was an absolute hell for him, he said, because he couldn't get out. He would scream, attempted suicide many times. I mean, his wrists are cut. He just wanted out because of the hallucination. One of the scenarios he remembers vividly, the light socket, the metal melted, and it transformed into a person in front of him. He's frozen with fear, and there's no one to help him. So you say that you have a mental illness and you need help. Guards will treat you differently. You will be abused more so. Sometimes people just suffer in silence.
Our project communicated with over 100 different men who are incarcerated in extreme isolation, and we found across the board that many of them experienced the same types of emotional and psychological effects after spending time in extreme isolation. These effects included anxiety, depression, uncontrollable impulses, and rage. And oftentimes these effects fueled irrational outbursts of aggression or violence.
The way I can describe the mood swings I had while locked in a cellar state is they were kind of like the temper tantrums I threw as a child. Raw and helpless moments of overwhelming and unchangeable emotions exploding out of me. I was anxious and overly frustrated because I couldn't seem to function properly. And then I would get so annoyed with my bunkmates that I would just beat on them or scream at them. And afterward I would feel so horrible. They were kind of like the temper tantrums I threw as a child. I knew it wasn't right, but at the same time I couldn't control it either. The guilt from this behavior is what actually pushed me over the edge and made me feel like I didn't deserve to live.
My son had described it as the walls were filled with feces all over and dry urine. The mattress they gave him was less than an inch. He actually slept on the floor rather than a mattress. At first they didn't give him any blanket. The blanket they gave him was really thin down. Holes in it. Toilet was stopped up. Just really disgusting. They're not getting food to eat. They get showers twice a week like he was garbage and he didn't matter. Slapped in the face, punched in the face and the eye. Not allowed to see medical. They would tell him, you're not shit, you don't matter. There was an infestation of bed bugs and it was cold. It was cold. He was always cold. Oh my God, and as a mother, your kid being hungry and cold and locked in a room, and like you can't do anything about it, I visualized it every night. There are things that I know when he comes home that I am not going to have the right ingredients to mend him.
Extreme isolation damages prisoners. It causes severe emotional and psychological trauma and harm. Many of these effects are lasting and will remain with prisoners when they return to the general prison population or when they return home to their family and friends.
Then I get depressed. Being in here is changes and start having mood swings and snapping on people when they talk to me. Being in here is changing me in a way I don't want to change.
This is what we're making. So these young people are going in, nothing's happening rehabilitative-wise, like people say. They're coming out really angry at a system that threw them away and harmed them.
The way the disciplinary process works is, in the prison system, there are many, many different rules. And prisoners who violate any one of those rules can potentially be sentenced to extreme isolation. Docs has claimed that the men that end up in extreme isolation are the most violent and dangerous prisoners in the general prison population, but we found that that simply was not the case. Only 16% of sentences to extreme isolation were for violent misbehavior, specifically assault or weapons.
When David first went to prison in January 2011, I didn't hear from him for a couple of weeks, and I didn't know when he had arrived. I was told a counselor would call me and all of that. I didn't hear from him. I became concerned. I called downstate, and they told me on the phone he was in the box. And he got in there the day he went in. He tried to take Suboxone with him. And so they gave him 30 days in the box. 30 days for bringing in a prescription drug. And that's when I first learned the box is used for anything. It's the first line of punishment. So when he got the sentence of 6 months for writing to his girlfriend, I thought this is just more of the same. They are using tier 3 tickets and the box as a first line of punishment, not even considering whether it's violent or non-violent. That doesn't even matter. If it's violent, I don't know what they do. I guess it's a longer sentence. I don't understand the mentality of treating everyone like the worst criminal who's in there, like the mass murderer who's a true sociopath. This is someone who committed a non-violent drug crime. Can they take a moment just to assess him and say, you know, that he doesn't need this?
We've been through this before. New York experimented with extreme isolation back in the 19th century, and that experiment found that its use was extremely harmful, totally unnecessary, and that experiment was quickly abandoned. Yet here we are again, in the midst of another human rights crisis. New York's use of extreme isolation today is just as arbitrary and unnecessary as it was back in the 19th century. There are real alternatives to extreme isolation to protect safety both inside and outside our prisons.
Extreme isolation is a human rights violation. It's inhumane, it causes prisoner trauma and suffering, and we need to change it now.
Well, I don't know what the purpose of incarceration is supposed to be, but it destroys spirits, and not just a spirit, spirits of humanity, communities. It affects the world as a whole. It's inhumane on that level. It's not just small pockets of people that are affected. It's a worldwide issue. It's torture.
Because the system is debilitative rather than rehabilitative, I think that the effect that has on prisoners, you just have a large population of people whose minds are in the same place as when they went in, you know. So why not take the time that they are already, you know, sentenced to and rehabilitate?
It was bad when they're in prison. That's really bad. But it raises it to a new level when they're in the box. You're driving away and you feel as though you're leaving them in harm's way. So I'm leaving knowing there's nothing I can do. I just have to drive home. And you live moment to moment, day to day.
So I want to turn to the report now and basically just walk you briefly through our methodology, the findings, and the recommendations. And I apologize if I am a bit redundant, although I will flesh out some of the points that were made in the video. As a preface, I just want to say a little word about why we undertook the project. The American Civil Liberties Union, which is the umbrella organization under which the New York Civil Liberties Union is nested, has a national prison project which advocates on behalf of prisoners across the country and litigates conditions of confinement. And the National Prison Project has been observing the use of solitary confinement across the country for the past decade with increasing concern. And it's made challenging the practice a priority issue. Simultaneously, the New York Civil Liberties Union receives hundreds and hundreds of prisoner letters every year, and many of those letters are from individuals that are incarcerated in solitary confinement. So the project sought to take a closer look at the state level of what was going on and to try and understand what was happening. And I also wanted to add a terminological note. As was mentioned in the video, throughout the report and for the remainder of the talk, I'm actually going to refer to solitary confinement as extreme isolation. And the reason for that is because New York employs a unique brand of solitary where about half of the men spend 23 hours locked down alone in a cell, and the other half spend those 23 hours locked down with another individual. So we use that term extreme isolation to capture the practice of subjecting one or two individuals in a cell to the conditions that we commonly understand as solitary confinement. So in terms of our methodology, we relied on a variety of quantitative and qualitative sources of information. As I mentioned before, first and foremost, we communicated with over 100 prisoners that are currently or have recently spent significant periods of time in extreme isolation. And these men were very diverse in terms of their backgrounds. They ranged in age from 17 to their 50s. They were Black, white, Hispanic. They were convicted of crimes ranging from nonviolent drug offenses to violent felonies. And nearly all will return home one day, some within the next few years. We also interviewed family members, as you can see from the video, and corrections employees. Finally, we considered these stories juxtaposed against the scientific literature, legal standards, and thousands of pages of previously unreleased records from the Department of Corrections, which we obtained through New York's open records laws. So what did we find? I'll start with the hard numbers. On any given day, New York incarcerates approximately 4,500 men in extreme isolation, which is about 8% of the overall prison population. About 2,000 of those men are housed in dedicated extreme isolation facilities upstate, which you saw in the video, and Southport correctional facilities. About half of the men, as I mentioned, in extreme isolation are housed alone in a cell the size of a typical elevator. The other half are housed with another individual in a cell the size of a typical parking space. Many thousands more men cycle in and out of extreme isolation every year. The Department of Corrections supervises about 56,000 prisoners, and last year it issued over 13,500 sentences to extreme isolation. So how do men end up in these types of conditions? The New York prison system, like all prison systems, are strictly regimented environments where prisoners have to conform to a very elaborate set of rules which govern virtually every aspect of their behavior. And a violation of any one of those rules can result in punishment. In New York, there is basically no meaningful constraint on the use of extreme isolation as punishment. Virtually any prisoner can go in for breaking any prison rule. And the Department of Corrections' own data illustrated that 5 out of 6 sentences to extreme isolation were for nonviolent misbehavior. Some common examples include testing positive for marijuana, selling contraband such as chewing tobacco, and cutting class or work duty. Before receiving a sentence to extreme isolation, there are some procedural protections in play. Prisoners are granted a disciplinary hearing, but that hearing is overseen by an officer who's an employee at the facility, and there are virtually no rules of evidence. And so these hearings often boil down to the testimony of a corrections officer versus that of a prisoner. And not surprisingly, prisoner testimony is often discredited. We reviewed many disciplinary records, and we saw that many convictions were based solely on the written or oral testimony of a corrections officer. The DOC's data shows that 95% of hearings that could potentially result in extreme isolation find prisoners guilty, which gives you some sense of how flawed the disciplinary system is. The population of prisoners in extreme isolation is also very diverse, and you'll see that extreme isolation captures a wide swath of individuals, including those that are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of extreme isolation. So these include juveniles whose minds are still developing, the elderly whose minds and bodies are increasingly fragile, and many individuals suffering from mental health and substance abuse issues. The capriciousness of this system is further suggested by the disproportionate number of Black prisoners placed in extreme isolation, which is above and beyond the overrepresentation of Black men in the overall prison population. Finally, with respect to the system, there's no limit to the amount of time a person can be sentenced. The average sentence is 5 months. Many languish far longer. And once placed in extreme isolation, it's very difficult to get out. The slightest infraction can extend your sentence by months or even years. So what happens to individuals inside extreme isolation? Prisoners in extreme isolation live in a world of unrelenting monotony and idleness. They spend 23 hours a day in a small barren cell. Their meals arrive through a slot in the door. They receive no programming whatsoever, whether it be educational, rehabilitative, or transitional. Phone calls are prohibited, personal possessions are few, and recreation is 1 hour alone in an empty cage that prisoners and correction staff alike refer to as a human kennel. Neglect is common, mistreatment and abuse rampant. Prisoners can be deprived of anything and everything, including exercise, showers, clothing, bedding, and even toilet paper as punishment for additional infractions while in extreme isolation, and also at the whim of corrections officers. Medical and mental health care is elusive. This combination of isolation and deprivation inflicts grave emotional and psychological harm. One individual who spent 9 months in extreme isolation told us that it bred wild and uncontrollable mood swings that vacillated between violence directed at his cellmate and scathing guilt. His anecdote is consistent with decades of scientific research that has documented that even among the healthy and mentally stable, extreme isolation induces anxiety, depression, despair, rage, and uncontrollable impulses. And for vulnerable prisoners, it can be devastating and potentially life-threatening, leading to self-harm and attempted suicide. The same individual who described his mood swings requested mental health counseling for the 9 months that he was in extreme isolation. His pleas were ignored during that entire period, and he ended up attempting suicide. Extreme isolation has very harmful ripple effects for both the general prison population and for our home communities. One individual wrote of his transition back to the general prison population, "My mood swings still linger. I was terror-stricken for the first 2 weeks. That kind of behavior is nothing like me at all. My confidence in myself and my ability to communicate is more challenged now. My depression is pretty bad off too. All I know is I was fine, and then I went to the box, and it seems like part of me is still there." Prisoners also carry the effects of extreme isolation back home. The Department of Corrections releases 25,000 prisoners per year, 2,000 of whom are released directly from extreme isolation to the street. And while in extreme isolation, as I mentioned, they receive no educational, vocational, rehabilitative, or transitional programming, leaving them utterly unprepared to rejoin society. One individual who I interviewed will be directly released from extreme isolation in September 2015, and his ambition is to work in an office one day. He desperately doesn't want to return to prison, but he knows he's not set up for anything else because he has no access to the education or training that would prepare him to enter the workforce. He said, "The nightmare starts with the realization I'm going home from the box." So it's hard to believe after everything I've just said, but there actually is a glimmer of hope. So I want to begin with a premise, which is that separating prisoners from the general prison population is an important corrections tool. The Department of Corrections needs to remove chronically violent or extremely vulnerable prisoners from the general prison population, both for the safety of other prisoners as well as for staff. But prisoner separation is absolutely not synonymous with subjecting individuals to inhumane and counterproductive forms of isolation and deprivation. Over the past few years, there are other states that have actually adopted this premise and have shown a couple of pathways to reform. So in Colorado, a few years ago, the legislature ordered an independent review of solitary confinement, and it ended up transferring about 30% of that population back to the general prison population, and that review is still underway. In Maine, the legislature commissioned a similar study and ended up ultimately transferring 70% of the population in extreme isolation back to the general prison population. And in Mississippi, of all states, an ACLU lawsuit prompted a review of their practices, and 85% of the population in extreme isolation was eventually transferred back to the general prison population. What's amazing is that none of these reforms adversely impacted safety in these correctional systems. In fact, correctional officials in all 3 states believe that the reforms have made their prisons safer. It's also allowed the 3 states to save millions in taxpayer dollars. Colorado and Mississippi closed dedicated extreme isolation facilities while transferring staff to other facilities. New York could accomplish similar reforms, and in fact, it doesn't need either the legislature or the courts to do so. Governor Cuomo and Department of Corrections Commissioner Fisher can take immediate steps. And when they do, or if they do, as it were, they must accomplish 2 equally important objectives. The first is to ensure that prisoners are separated appropriately in the future. And the second is to make sure that we remedy the current consequences of our misguided use of separation. So the first step that we recommend is that New York adopt clear and objective standards to ensure prisoners are separated only in limited and legitimate circumstances for the least amount of time and under the least restrictive conditions possible. We detail those standards in the report, but I'd like to mention that principle is endorsed both by mainstream legal organizations in the US, like the American Bar Association, but also by international human rights scholars, such as Professor Mendez. Our second recommendation is that New York conduct an immediate and transparent audit of the population currently in extreme isolation based on the standards which I just described, and immediately transfer those that do not fit that criteria back to the general prison population. Commissioner Fisher, prior to the publication of the report, admitted that New York, quote, overuses, unquote, isolation. And after the report, he publicly announced that the department was going to commence an internal review process. The position of the NYCLU is that New York, quote unquote, overuses isolation both in frequency and severity in a manner that shocks the collective conscience. And so tinkering at the edges is not an adequate response. And we believe that sweeping reforms are both necessary and readily achievable. I wanted to add, before I conclude, a little postscript that's also contained in the report, which is that solitary confinement exemplifies and crystallizes problems that afflict other aspects of the U.S. criminal justice system. For example, one that's been alluded to repeatedly throughout the day is the problem of mass incarceration. Solitary confinement, extreme isolation, is based on policies that are myopically focused on punishment and retribution as opposed to rehabilitation. They're also based on rhetoric and assumptions rather than hard data, evidence, and analysis of what the most effective ways of dealing with, for example, misbehavior in the prison population is. And it also relies on politics that discredit the basic humanity of people who have committed crimes and sanctions treatment that conflicts with our fundamental values as well as basic human rights. So I began the talk by focusing on the micro, and so I end the talk by encouraging folks to consider the macro and to try and apply some of the themes and the lessons that we've learned throughout today to other areas of the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Who is the interlocutor? We've got a bunch of people here who should be writing letters to somebody. Who do we write letters to, and is this, you mentioned that it's Governor Cuomo and Commissioner Fisher. What concretely, I mean, what pressure can we tell our friends to put on people, and who specifically could do something tomorrow morning?
Right. Well, our hope is that the executive branch of the state government will undertake and initiate reform on its own. And of course, having some kind of political support for that reform is important. So members of the public writing letters to the governor and to the commissioner and explaining that they support an independent review and that they encourage reforms to the system is obviously helpful.
An independent review beyond what's going on already right now?
Well, the commissioner is currently undertaking an internal review, but it's really unclear. I mean, it's not a public review. So it would be great to be able to hold him accountable to whatever reforms he does suggest. And also, if they're inadequate, to encourage him to push further.
And just out of curiosity, did the earlier Governor Cuomo, was he part of what got this going, and the young Governor Cuomo has to dismantle stuff, or what are we dealing with here?
It was actually Governor Pataki that oversaw a lot of the expansion of the use of extreme isolation in New York.
I mean, I would think that Governor Cuomo, especially with his wider ambitions, could be shamed.
We hope so.
Let me ask a question of you, Juan. The same question. Is President Obama the interlocutor here?
Well, for the United Nations, obviously, yes. We have to communicate formally through...
Is that working?
Thank you. We have to communicate formally through the State Department, and more specifically through the UN mission in Geneva. And that complicates matters when the matter is more, a state matter, for example, because then I cannot communicate directly with the New York State. But obviously there are various ways in which more informally we make our views known. For example, I have filed amicus curiae brief with the Supreme Court and with courts in other countries and even international courts like the European Court of Human Rights. And I talk to the press as often as I am the subject of press inquiries, including in cases. Beyond that, I think the special rapporteurship should be considered a sort of a sounding board or a forum for advocacy, and the creativity of advocates, should know no limits in that sense. Yes, I communicate mostly with each central government, in this case with the federal government, but it's the United States government that is responsible to the rest of the world about whether there's been or not violations of the prohibition on torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment.
If you use the example of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, it was largely American embarrassment at the federal level over civil rights in the United States vis-a-vis the Cold War, the fight for the minds of Africa and so forth that was hugely important. Could a similar kind of shaming thing be brought to bear on the United States today at the federal level, and could the federal government in some way could this be taken out of state hands and made in the same way that civil rights was taken out of state hands?
Well, it's not going to be taken out of federal hands and put into the international community's hands. Let's be realistic on that. Right. Unfortunately, we can just contribute some views from the rest of the world, and it does, I think, contribute to shaming the fact that the company that the United States keeps with respect to treatment of prisoners is not very good company in the outside world. Iran, for example, Venezuela on treatment of prisoners, China. There's many, there are many worse things that happen around the world. And it's difficult to compare one with the other. But in terms of numbers, certainly, there may not be clear statistics, but just impressionistically, the number of cases that come to my attention as a special rapporteur and the estimates of how many people are at any given date in isolation in the United States is really staggering. I think in that sense, those comparisons should probably, help, in campaigns and advocacy strategies that can be used.
I guess the question I'm trying to ask is now I'm asking you not as the UN rapporteur, but as a professor at American University in Washington and so forth. Does this battle have to be done state by state, or can it be done at the federal level? And at the federal level, does it have to be done by lawyers going to the Supreme Court, or can it be done legislatively at the federal level, conceivably, or what could be done?
Well, one of the sad things that I've learned in looking at this is that especially because many states and even federal prison authorities use isolation as a form of prison management, quote unquote, and not as disciplinary, that federal courts particularly have, to a large extent, abdicated their responsibility and given a very, very wide discretion to the administrative authority, not even looking as to whether any due process rule has been violated. That's, kind of a sad commentary because, of course, judicial review of administrative decisions, not only prisons, but of everything, has been a hallmark of the way the United States has dealt with civil rights and human rights, and has been imitated by many countries around the world. The fact that the United States courts are going backwards in that sense, is of course a sad commentary, as I said. On the other hand, I think the fact that the United States has a very strong civil society and very savvy and very sophisticated legal and other organizations that can and do from time to time put barriers on what the prison authorities can do, is a really good example and a source of hope that things can be improved.
Can I maybe just add a point about the federalism angle, which is that I think it's interesting because compared to the civil rights example, I think that the states offer hope in terms of solitary confinement. It's really the states that are leading the reform, whereas the federal government, in a lot of ways, seems to be expanding its use of isolation. I believe the federal government just bought another facility in the Midwest that it intends to convert into a second ADX. The other thing is that ADX Florence is a solitary confinement facility, federal facility in Colorado. The other thing that I think is interesting is that, you know, when it comes to criminal justice, the vast majority of prisoners are held at the state level, not through the federal government. And so in order, just in terms, from a realistic point of view, in order for the United States to comply with international human rights norms, the states will have to comply. There's not, unless the Supreme Court reinterprets the Constitution to prohibit solitary confinement, it's really going to be left up to the states to decide what they're going to do with the vast majority of prisoners under their custody. And I think that we shouldn't think of that necessarily as a bad thing, because it creates 50 different entry points for the incorporation of certain types of norms. And there's some states that might actually be more amenable than even the federal government.
It struck me, one thing that all of us who are going to go home and write letters to Governor Cuomo and Fisher can write is, look, can we be maybe almost as good as Mississippi?
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful argument.
Yeah. You wanted to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add to what you have both said and to say what we really need to pressure for legal reform and political change is a social movement that starts with writing letters, but also takes other forms, like being involved with networks of activists who are pressuring on all kinds of different levels, making the connections between mass incarceration and solitary confinement and stop and frisk policies. And one of the things that I've learned from Russell Maroon Shoatz and his writing from his own solitary confinement cell is from his inspiration is fugitive slave communities and the sorts of decentralized social and political organizations, interracial support of basically poor people who have checked out of capitalist, colonialist society in order to create alternative forms of social relations and to resist the sort of system that we have. Our prison system is a continuation of colonization, and it's a way of continuing exactly that kind of deprivation of civil rights that the civil rights movement as a social movement was moving against. And so I think legal and political reforms are most effective when they rise up from this broader social base.
Right. One thing I think I'll say is I'll ask Stephanie again. Stephanie, one more round of applause for Stephanie. She especially since I've been asked her to do one more thing, which is on our website as of Monday, or give us a break maybe as of Tuesday, we will put addresses of some of the places. You'll give us the addresses of the Fisher and the governor, and we'll just have places that people who've been here who might want to write, and we'll include the Shoatz thing and
also solitarywatch.org.
Yeah,
one of the best one-stop shopping as a resource for action initiatives, reports. It's run by Jim Ridgway and Jean Casella.
So we'll have places to do, but also active things you can do, people addresses, and I think I like the let's catch up to Mississippi angle. I think that's good.
One more thing to add is that we are videoing this whole day, and we will be putting it up thanks to a great company called Really Useful Media, and they will have it in about 10 days or so. So we'll be putting it on our website. Solitary Watch will have it on theirs, and so hopefully we can disseminate it to various communities and to the media, so they can keep putting attention on the issue to pressure the social movement aspect as well as the legal and political reform.
So I think it's been a long day. We'll probably close in a second. Is there one or two questions from the audience? Yeah, do we have any? Quick, over here, there's one right over there. Right over there, Sam. Just a second, we're going to get you a microphone, and we're going to get to watch Sam run around, so that's all. And by the way, Sam Carter is also one of the people who's put this together, so thank you, Sam.
Thank you. I represent the Black Panther Commemoration Committee, New York City. And as you know, I hear you speaking about solitary confinement. Majority in New York State here, you have political prisoners that the United States do not recognize, as you know that. Panthers that got caught up in COINTELPRO, Russell Schultz being one of them, and we have others. And as you say that you're writing, we ask people to write the political prisoners because one of the things to do, their information coming out will help you to galvanize what you're talking about now. So
And
my
how do we
thing
get
is
how do we
to-
get addresses for people?
Well, yes, you can go to Jericho Movement, the Jericho Movement. They have a lawn Jericho organization, and you go on their line, and they have listings of all the political prisoners. But keep in mind, they moved them. That's the catch in this whole phase. They move these political prisoners around so that you folks to know. And as they move them, this causes them to pay. These prisoners have to pay to be moved.
What do you
I
mean?
don't know if you guys know that or not.
How do you mean?
They pay. They have to pay. When they be moved, that pay has to come out their commissary to be moved. In other words, you pay to be in prison today. You have to understand that. I don't know if people understood that or not. You pay to be, matter of fact, you pay to be on parole.
And post-release.
And post-release.
The prisoners have to pay. So it's a catch 2020 in this whole situation, if you understand what I'm saying. It's almost like the time of sharecroppers. So
Well,
forth.
it's exactly
You
like the
always
time
hold
of, it's exactly
towards
like
a
the time
payment.
of sharecroppers, yeah.
Okay? So I just want you guys to know this.
Let her, go ahead. Well, 1 second. Wait, you can talk till you have a microphone, and then you get to talk.
Hi, it's an honor to
Identify
have you.
yourself again, please.
Oh, I'm Teresa Schultz. I'm the daughter of Russell Schultz, who's been mentioned here. Bigger than that is that we need to acknowledge that every last one of us here are taxpayers. Some of us are, who may be employed. We're footing that bill also. So every day that a prisoner is being tortured, presently, right now, being tortured, you are footing that bill as a taxpayer. So when these elections come up, and I'm not talking about the hope and the change that was back last week sometime, we're talking about that you're footing a bill and they use crime, war on drugs. Every time this country feel like they want to eliminate people or poor folks or just to lock up folks. And the crime rate had decreased, but yet they keep hyping it up, especially at elections. Now, when he talked about the political prisoners, yes, before this thing became fashionable to be called solitary units, solitary confinement, it was just a hole. And you were thrown in there, and it was a dark place, and there were limits, 90 days. But they made it real popular around people who stood up and fought against the unjust, the issues that were going on behind prison doors. And those are some of the political prisoners that he's talking about. Anyone that stands up and speak out against injustice, those are the ones like my dad approaching 70 years old, in solitary 30 years, doesn't even know what he looks like. He doesn't have a mirror. And he was very disappointed with me recently when I told him, I said, oh, you got some gray. And he said, what? You didn't tell me. He was so upset that I hadn't told him. Of course, I had seen it prior to that visit, but I thought he knew. And in 30 years, I didn't know that he wasn't able to see himself in the mirror. So that's inhumane in itself. If you can't even detect or know what you look like anymore in 30 years. So we as taxpayers, I just want to bottom line that. We're helping to foot this type of bill. And don't think, the question wasn't really addressed earlier. What do we do with those people that should be in solitary? Well, first of all, for those vicious crimes, those folks properly need to be treated and medicated. There are tons of mentally ill folks behind in solitary that most of them do kill themselves. And we have a report on the Human Rights Coalition website that stated a guard teased a mentally ill guy in solitary, kept telling him, kill yourself, just go ahead. He said, but I do want to kill myself. He said, go ahead, kill yourself, get it over with. And he ended up killing himself about 3 months ago.
Thank you. Robert has something he wants to say.
Briefly, I just wanted to say briefly, go back to one pivot on off of one thing that was said. Human rights, I think what we need to do, if we really want to get it federal, like get it out the state, there is a way it can be done. Malcolm showed us this a long time ago. We raised it to the level of human rights. Solitary confinement is a violation of human rights. The way it's constructed, we raise it to the level of a violation of human rights, and then we can look at the way it is now. President Obama, or whoever the president is, they don't interfere with state. That is not, they could pardon the turkey at Christmas time, but it is not within their realm to pardon a state prisoner. But if we raise it to the level of a human rights violation, solitary confinement, then he has to, his office, his administration, somebody in his administration have to adhere and answer to this.
Okay, great.
Oh, sorry.
Just wanted to briefly talk about the denial of parole, how it's just constantly being denied to prisoners for no ungodly reason. And I think we also need to address the issue of parole and the parole board and how that is all established and how we can redetermine and relook at those people who haven't committed any problems and then come up for parole and are still denied.
Okay, thank you. Over here, our friend. I think actually I'm going to give you the last word.
Thank you. Wow. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thank everyone for coming out. Everybody who made an effort to stand up against crimes against humanity. That's why I look at it as, because that's exactly what it is. I encourage that if you are searching for means to help or play a part in the role, all of these websites, especially New York City Liberties Union, has links to other sites that affects everywhere in New York and every other place in the world. I had a question. Actually, I don't want to make you mad because I need more booklets from you. My Know Your Rights tour. I'm actually going through every neighborhood trying to distribute rights because education is the key. So people who are, if this is a shock to you that these things go on, imagine to people who don't know and they're being violated. So education is the key, number one. I just say that. So I'm going through every housing community in New York, giving out pamphlets, Know Your Rights booklets. Some of them I get from different places, but they get tired of me coming back and forth. What are we going to do? I have a question for you as far as, do we have a educated plan as far as the process that deals with the positive reintegration of inmates back into society? And I'm not talking about, okay, I was in Auburn for 3 years. I was on Auburn census. Auburn is getting money for the inmates that are being in there, because there's over 3,000 inmates that go through transit. So if you're there from Thursday and they don't do transit on Monday and you're there till Wednesday, you're on account. And being on account means that county gets money for you being there in that jail because it's a transit jail. So there's a lot of loopholes in prison that people don't know about. I could be here all night telling you about them. But they get funding for that town. So that town gets a recreation center because their census is an extra 4,000 or 5,000 inmates and actually an extra 5,000 or 10,000 more inmates because it's a transit jail that holds for more than 3 days. If you hold for more than 3 days, you're in account. So it's a lot of loopholes there. But when they leave there, they're returned back to their county of conviction, which might be where they actually got locked up at in the same spot. So these things are no positive reintegration back into society, and what efforts are we going to make for the future, or do you have planned to at least exercise these rights? Thank you.
So I'll speak to that generally, although I don't have a concrete plan as to that. But when I mentioned at the end of my talk that solitary confinement crystallizes a lot of issues that afflict other parts of the criminal justice system, I think one area where that's really obvious is the lack of emphasis on rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. And so when we see men in solitary confinement, they're not receiving any programming. That's not to say that men in the general prison population are receiving the programming that they need. And one of the things that one sort of talking point I try to use when I talk to people that either don't seem to care or don't really know a lot about how the prison system works and how it affects us in our daily lives, I point out that it costs $60,000 to incarcerate one person in the New York prison system per year. $60,000. That's more than a year of college education in the state. And so the question is, how are we allocating these resources? And so, you know, I'm not a fiscal expert, but I do believe that, for example, if we were going to shut down solitary confinement facilities and reallocate that money should be reallocated towards more productive uses. For example, more programming, more rehabilitative therapy, really addressing the underlying causes of people's incarceration to begin with, and that sort of thing.
Well, thank all of you. I think we'll release you into the general population. Thank you at all of you for having come and for the people who made comments, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.